In this final section, we will be dealing with the final section of the book of Joshua, which is the last 3 chapters. And in a sense, there's sort of wrap-ups in different ways. I've just called it farewells. It's kind of an unoriginal title, but we have Joshua saying, kind of wrapping things up in chapter 22. In the first 6 verses, he's commending the tribes who are going to settle east of the Jordan, who had originally asked for land back in Numbers east of the Jordan. And in chapter 1, verses 12 to 18, Joshua reminded of them of their obligations to go with their brothers to take the land, but then come back and settle after that. Joshua commends them in chapter 22, verses 1 to 6, that they did that. They did well. The rest of the chapter shows the kind of a misunderstanding that these tribes east of the Jordan are wanting to set up an altar that commemorates that and commemorates their brotherhood with the tribes on the other side of the Jordan. They feared that in times to come, the Jordan River itself would become a barrier and they would lose their identity with their other tribes. The tribes west of the Jordan saw the altar and thought that as an altar of false worship. And so they prepare to attack these tribes east of the Jordan. And these eastern tribes quickly clarify what their intentions were, and then things are settled down. But that shows the unity of the body in a sense. Same that goes back to chapter 1 that we didn't really emphasize, but you can see it there in chapter 1, the emphasis on the unity there. Chapter 22 and 23, chapters 23 and 24 are 2 of Joshua's farewell speeches. And we'll just highlight a couple things in Joshua's final speech in the final chapter, in chapter 24. So look at that passage, and I want to just light in on one passage in chapter 24, in verse 13. It says, I gave you, Joshua speaking on the Lord's behalf, I gave you a land on which you had not labored, cities you had not built, and you dwelt in them. You eat the fruit of the vineyards and olive orchards that you did not plant. Now, we've mentioned that already as part of the inheritance. It goes back to the passage in Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verses 10 and 11, where God says, I'm going to give you land with cities you did not build, vineyards that you did not plant, wells you did not dig, etc. So this is an explicit fulfillment of that promise in the book of Deuteronomy. A really curious passage here in this chapter is a couple of verses later. It's actually the next verse, in verse 14, where it says, Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. The reference to beyond the river is reference to the river Euphrates, and this would be where Abraham and his family lived, and they originally worshipped other gods. You remember the story of Rachel stealing the household idols from Laban's household back in Genesis. So they did serve other gods there. They apparently served other gods in Egypt. And Joshua tells this group, this generation, put away the gods that your ancestors have worshipped. So kind of in an oblique fashion, despite all the warm fuzzies we feel in the book of Joshua, that everything's working out well and everybody's responding well and they're affirming all the right things. This is another sort of little ticking time bomb that there are still pockets, at least, of people worshiping the gods of their ancestors. And again, this kind of sets the stage for the explosion of chaos in the next book. It's a tragic kind of a thing. Finally, a couple more things, but in the verses 25 to 27, we have the renewal of the covenant. Got Joshua, verse 25, made a covenant with the people that day, put in place statutes and rules for them at Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law. He took a large stone, set it upon the terebinth there, and he said to the people, this stone shall be witnesses and all that. Remember in the passage in Deuteronomy 17, the king is to be rooted in God's word, and it says he's to write for himself a copy of this law and to keep it with him and so on. Now Joshua, the man, is not a king, but as we pointed out in chapter 1, the key to success for him was the same as the key to success for the king. We see him, in a sense, acting like a king here in writing the the words of the law and affirming the covenant. Finally, the last section is a series of 3 little death notices, and just mention the one about Joseph in verse 32. As for the bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel brought out from Egypt, they buried them at Shechem, and it became an inheritance for the descendants of Joseph. That goes back to Genesis, the end of the book of Genesis, where Joseph extracted a promise from the people that they would bring his bones back, and it doesn't happen till hundreds of years later, but it did happen. And it's another fulfillment of promises that we see earlier in the book. I forgot to mention early on in one of the earlier lectures, so I'll just mention now at the end, that I've written a book, or a commentary on the book of Joshua in the New American Commentary series. It's a good series, one you should at least know about, and if you'd like to know much more in depth of what I think about all these things, you can check out this book in the New American Commentary series.